I have been hunting in the Appalachian Mountains since I was 16 years old. My grandfather taught me everything I know about tracking, reading signs in the forest, and respecting the wilderness. This past fall, I decided to head out alone into the mountains of eastern Tennessee. My goal was simple. I wanted to photograph wildlife and maybe get a deer if the opportunity presented itself. I packed everything I needed: my hunting rifle, camera equipment, and camping gear for 3 nights. I chose an area far from the main trails, near an old abandoned cabin my grandfather had told me about years ago. I did not think much about the strange stories he used to tell. I just wanted some quiet time in nature. I left early on a Friday morning in October, excited to disconnect from everything. The drive from Knoxville took about 3 hours. I parked at a small gravel lot and started hiking into the forest around 9 in the morning. The weather was perfect. Golden leaves were falling and the air was crisp, sitting around 50 degrees. I followed an old trail for about 2 hours, enjoying the solitude. Around the halfway point, I passed a through hiker coming the opposite direction. We exchanged quick greetings, and he asked if I was planning to go far. I told him I would be camping for 3 nights. He nodded but hesitated for a second, then said, "Be careful out there." I thanked him and kept moving, not thinking much of it. Eventually, I left the main trail and used my GPS to navigate toward the area where the old cabin was supposed to be. Everything was incredibly quiet, just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. I found the cabin a little after noon. It was small, weathered, and clearly abandoned for many years. The windows were broken, and the front door was slightly open, hanging crooked on rusty hinges. I decided not to go inside. Instead, I set up my tent about 50 feet away, near a small stream under the shade of a large oak tree. I spent the next hour getting everything organized, arranging my gear, and setting up a few camera traps to capture wildlife activity. For lunch, I ate a simple sandwich and some trail mix. In the afternoon, I explored the surrounding area looking for animal signs. I found several deer tracks, fresh droppings, and a well-worn game trail. I placed one of my camera traps along that trail, hopping to get some good shots. By 4 in the afternoon, I returned to camp. When I glanced over at the cabin, I noticed the door was now fully closed. I figured the wind must have pushed it shut. It struck me as slightly odd, but I brushed it off. I spent the rest of the evening preparing dinner, boiling water, and eating some instant noodles by my small fire. The sun went down early, and by 6:30 darkness had settled in completely. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to music through my earbuds and watching the flames flicker. Around 8, I decided to call it a night and climbed into my tent. I turned off my flashlight and settled into my sleeping bag, feeling tired from the long hike. At first, I heard only the normal sounds of the forest: wind rustling leaves, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. Then suddenly I heard a distinct knocking sound, 3 deliberate knocks on wood coming from the direction of the cabin. I sat up immediately and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the cabin. Nothing. The structure sat there in the darkness, silent and still. I told myself it was probably a branch falling against the door. I lay back down and tried to relax. 15 minutes later, the knocking came again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, unmistakable. My chest tightened. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, sweeping my flashlight beam across the clearing. I saw nothing. No movement, no animals, no people. I walked closer to the cabin, stopping about 20 feet away. I looked through one of the broken windows, but the inside was pitch black. I called out, "Anyone there?" Silence. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the cold air, then turned and walked back to my tent. I zipped it shut and lay down, but sleep would not come. I kept listening, straining to hear anything unusual. Around 11 at night, I was still wide awake when I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human footsteps crunching through dry leaves. My heart began to race. I turned off my flashlight and stayed completely still. The footsteps came closer, right up to my tent, and then stopped. I could hear someone breathing just outside. I gripped my hunting knife tightly, barely daring to move. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, heading toward the cabin. I carefully unzipped a small section of the tent and peeked out. In the moonlight, I saw the silhouette of a man standing in front of the cabin. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket. He did not move for several minutes. He just stood there, staring at the cabin door. I did not make a sound. Then slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. A faint light appeared in one of the windows, flickering like a candle. My mind raced. Part of me thought maybe this was just a homeless person looking for shelter. But the way he had walked right up to my tent, the way he had stood there listening, it felt wrong. After about 10 minutes, the light inside the cabin went out. I lay in my tent, knife in hand, unable to sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke around 6:30, I carefully unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The cabin door was closed again. There was no sign of anyone. I felt exhausted but decided to check one of my camera traps to distract myself and calm my nerves. I walked about 200 yards to the first camera I had set up along the game trail. I pulled out the SD card and scrolled through the images on my camera's screen. Deer, a raccoon, a couple of foxes. Then I froze. One image showed a human figure walking past the camera. The timestamp read 2:47 in the morning. The figure was blurry, but the build matched the man I had seen last night. My stomach dropped. I hurried back to camp, feeling more uneasy with every step. As I approached my tent, I looked down at the ground and saw boot prints in the soft dirt. Large prints with deep treads circling all the way around my tent. He had been watching me while I tried to sleep. That was enough. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. But before I did, something compelled me to check inside the cabin one more time. I walked up to the door and knocked, calling out, "Is anyone in there?" No answer. I pushed the door open slowly and shined my light inside. On the floor, I saw an old sleeping bag, a few empty food cans, and a lighter, but no person. I turned to head back to my tent when I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around and saw him. The man was standing about 30 feet away, partially hidden by the trees. Now in the daylight, I could see his face more clearly. He had a long beard, wild hair, and hollow eyes that stared directly at me without blinking. He said nothing. I tried to keep my voice steady and said, "Hey, I did not mean to bother you. I am just leaving." He did not respond. He just tilted his head slightly as if studying me. Then, without warning, he started walking toward me. I took several steps back and said louder, "I do not want any trouble." He stopped about 15 feet away. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then he turned and started walking back toward the tree line. But before he disappeared, he looked over his shoulder and said in a low, rasping voice, "You should not be here." A chill ran through me. I did not wait another second. I ran back to my tent, stuffed everything into my backpack as fast as I could, and left behind a few items that were not important. I grabbed my rifle, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started moving quickly toward the main trail. I did not look back. I kept a fast pace for about 15 minutes, my legs burning, my lungs gasping for air. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I glanced behind me. No one. But the feeling of being watched never left. I pushed forward, moving as quickly as I could until I reached the parking area. I got to my truck around 10 in the morning. The hike that had taken me 2 hours the day before, I covered in less than 3. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. I started the engine and drove to the nearest town, a small place about 20 minutes away. I found the local police station and went inside. I told the officer on duty what had happened. He listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Yeah, we get reports like this from time to time. There are people who live out in those mountains. We call them mountain people. Most of them just want to be left alone. They are not usually dangerous, but it is best not to interact with them." He asked if I wanted them to send someone out to check the area. I told him I was not even sure the man would still be there. He took down my information and said they would keep an eye on it. I thanked him and left. The drive home felt long. For the next few days, I could not stop thinking about what had happened. The image of that man standing there, staring at me with those empty eyes, replayed in my mind over and over. I have been camping and hunting my entire life, but I have never felt fear like that. It was not just the isolation or the surprise of finding someone out there. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the one who did not belong. I never went back to that area. I still go camping, but now I stick to places with more people around, places where I know I am not alone. That experience taught me something important. The wilderness is not just home to animals. Sometimes it is home to people who have chosen to disappear. And when you stumble into their world, you realize just how vulnerable you really are. I am grateful nothing worse happened that night. But I will never forget the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, or the cold, emotionless voice telling me I should not have been there. I have always found peace on two wheels. Not the kind of peace you get from meditation apps or beach vacations, but the real kind. The kind that comes from pushing yourself through mountain trails where your legs burn and your lungs scream for air. Last September, I decided to bike a 3-day loop through the Maroon Bells Snowmass Wilderness in Colorado. It was my first solo bike camping trip in the Rockies. I had done plenty of day rides, but never anything this remote. I was ready for the challenge and the solitude I craved. I left the Maroon Lake trailhead at 6:30 in the morning. The sky was crystal clear and the temperature hovered around 50 degrees, perfect biking weather. The aspen trees were already turning, splashes of gold and crimson against the dark green pines. I pedaled along the gravel path, listening to the creek rushing beside me. My pack was loaded with everything I needed for 3 days. Tent, sleeping bag, food, a bike pump, and repair tools. I felt prepared for anything. The first 15 miles passed without seeing another soul. I stopped around 4 in the afternoon beside a small stream to eat a protein bar and stretch my legs. That is when I noticed it. A small cairn, maybe 3 or 4 rocks stacked on top of each other, sitting right beside the trail. I figured it was just a marker left by another hiker to indicate the path. People do that all the time in the backcountry. I did not think much of it. I kept riding for another 5 miles before finding a good spot to set up camp. The clearing was nestled among a stand of pine trees with a view overlooking the valley below. I pitched my tent, boiled water for instant noodles, and sat watching the sun dip behind the peaks. By 8 o'clock, I was zipped up in my sleeping bag. That is when I noticed how quiet everything was. No insects buzzing, no owls hooting, no wind rustling through the trees, just complete, unnatural silence. I told myself it was probably just the sudden cold snap. Animals hunker down when the temperature drops. Still, it felt wrong somehow. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but it was restless. I woke up at 6 the next morning while it was still dim outside. I made instant coffee and ate a granola bar while sitting on a flat rock near my tent. By 7:30, I had packed everything up and was back on the trail. About 2 miles in, I spotted another cairn. This one was bigger, maybe 6 or 7 stones stacked neatly. It looked fresh, like someone had just built it. I slowed down and stared at it for a moment. Someone else must be riding the same route, I thought. Half a mile later, I found another one. This cairn was placed in a strange spot, not at a fork in the trail or anywhere that would need a marker. It sat right in the middle of the path, forcing me to swerve around it. An uneasy feeling crept into my chest. I kept pedaling. Another mile down the trail, I stopped on a slope to drink some water. That is when I looked back and saw tire tracks in the dirt, fresh ones, but they were not mine. The tread pattern was different, deeper, newer. The tracks followed my direction but stopped abruptly, like whoever made them had turned off into the woods. I called out, "Hello, anyone out there?" Nothing, just silence. A chill ran down my spine. I got back on my bike and pedaled faster. Around noon, I stopped for lunch at a small alpine lake. I sat on a boulder and unwrapped the sandwich I had packed. Halfway through eating, I heard a loud crack like a branch snapping. It came from behind me, maybe 40 or 50 feet away. I spun around. Nothing but trees. I listened carefully. The forest was completely silent again. If it had been a deer or an elk, I would have heard more movement. Animals do not just make one sound and then freeze, but that is exactly what this felt like. One deliberate snap, then nothing. I stood up and walked a few steps into the woods to investigate. No animal tracks, no broken branches on the ground, but then I saw it. Another cairn hidden about 30 feet off the trail deep in the trees, who would come out here just to stack rocks. My heart started pounding. I hurried back to my bike and took off. About 10 minutes later, I glanced over my shoulder. I caught a flash of dark blue fabric between the trees. I slammed on my brakes and stared. Nothing. No movement. No color, just trees. My chest felt tight. I pedaled as hard as I could for the next 2 hours without stopping. By 5 in the afternoon, I decided to set up camp early. My legs were aching and I wanted time to pitch my tent before dark. I found a flat spot near a small creek, about 100 feet off the main trail. I thought if I stayed hidden, I might feel safer. I set up my tent and arranged my gear inside. Then I walked down to the creek to collect water and gather some firewood. When I came back, my stomach dropped. There was a cairn sitting directly in front of my tent. 5 stones stacked perfectly, sitting right at the entrance. My hands started shaking. There was no way that cairn appeared naturally. Someone had been here while I was gone. Someone knew exactly where I was camping. I looked around frantically. No one. I kicked the cairn over, scattering the stones. Anger mixed with fear flooded through me. I pulled the small knife from my boot and kept it in my pocket. I cooked dinner quickly, barely tasting the food. I decided not to build a fire. I did not want to attract attention. By 7:30, before it was fully dark, I climbed into my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag fully dressed, clutching the knife, listening to every sound outside. I could not sleep. Around 10 o'clock I heard rustling in the woods, not animal sounds, footsteps, human footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. The footsteps stopped about 15 feet from my tent. I could hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing like someone who was tired or worked up. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. My body trembled. The breathing continued for several minutes. Then the footsteps started again, moving slowly around to the other side of my tent. Whoever it was, they were studying me, watching me. Around 11, the sound stopped, but I never heard footsteps walking away. That meant whoever it was still out there, standing silently in the dark, waiting. I lay frozen until 2 in the morning. Then I heard it. The sound of my tent zipper being pulled. Someone was trying to open my tent. I screamed, "Get away from me, I have a knife." The zipper stopped immediately. I heard fast footsteps crashing through the underbrush, moving away into the forest. I lay there shaking until sunrise. At 5:30, the sky was just beginning to lighten. I did not wait another second. I packed my gear as fast as I could, my hands trembling so badly I could barely buckle my backpack. I stuffed things into my bag without caring if they were organized. I just needed to get out. The route back to the parking lot was 25 miles, but I could not go back the way I came. I was too afraid I would run into whoever had been stalking me. I chose a different trail, looping through Buckskin Pass. It was steeper and harder, but I did not care. I pedaled nonstop for 2 hours. My legs burned and my heart hammered in my chest like a drum. Around 8 in the morning, I stopped briefly to drink water. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the bottle. I bent down to pick it up. When I stood back up, I saw her. A woman standing about 60 feet away, right in the middle of the trail. Her hair was matted and filthy, her clothes torn and stained. Her face was smeared with dirt. She looked like she had been living in the woods for years. She did not say anything. She just stood there, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. In her hand she held something. It looked like a small hatchet or a hammer. There was something dark on it, dried blood. I did not think. I jumped on my bike and pedaled like my life depended on it. I did not look back. The woman did not chase me, but I could feel her eyes on me the entire time. I kept pedaling for another hour until I reached the highest point of the pass. From there, I could see the parking lot far below. I flew down the slope, nearly crashing several times but refusing to slow down. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my bike into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove away without looking back. I went straight to the ranger station in Aspen. I walked in and told the ranger on duty everything. The cairns, the footsteps, the woman with the hatchet. He took notes, but I could tell he was not taking it seriously. He said I probably encountered a transient or someone living off the grid. He told me that area sometimes had homeless people who camped illegally in the backcountry. He promised to check it out, but I left feeling like nothing would come of it. For days afterward, I could not sleep. I kept seeing that woman's face in my mind. I decided to post about my experience on a Colorado hiking forum. I was not expecting much, just needed to get it off my chest. Within 2 days, I received 6 private messages. The first was from a man who had hiked that area 3 years earlier. He said he found cairns just like mine and felt like he was being followed for 2 days straight. The second was from a woman who went camping with her boyfriend. They found cairns and small animal bones arranged in a circle around their tent. The third was from a man who had been trail running when a woman matching my description chased him with a hatchet. He barely escaped. The fourth message was from a couple who heard someone trying to unzip their tent at night. In the morning, they found blood smeared on the outside of their tent. The fifth was from a solo hiker who discovered an abandoned sleeping bag and old clothes deep in the forest. He said the smell was unbearable. The sixth was from a woman who saw the same woman I described, standing in the distance, watching her. She never went back to that area again. All of them were in the Maroon Bells area within a 10-mile radius. I forwarded all the messages to the ranger station. They said they would investigate more seriously. But as of now, I have not heard anything back. I will never go solo camping in Colorado again. I still ride my bike, but only on popular trails where there are plenty of people around. Some places are not meant to be explored alone. I've always had a thing for abandoned cabins in the Appalachian wilderness. Maybe it's in my blood. My uncle was a logger and hunter who spent years working deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I grew up hearing his stories, tales of long, cold nights alone in old cabins, strange sounds in the darkness, the feeling of complete isolation. I used to hang on every word, completely mesmerized. Back then, I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life but following in his footsteps. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. I ended up taking a completely different path, far from mountain cabins and forest trails. Still, I never lost my love for hiking or for those old forgotten structures where my uncle once sought shelter. About a year ago, my uncle died suddenly from a heart attack. He was only 62. The family didn't want much of his stuff, so I ended up with most of it. Among the boxes was an old metal case I'd never seen before. It took me months to work up the nerve to open it. Inside were cassette tapes, maybe a dozen of them, each labeled with dates and locations. I had to dig out an old cassette player from a thrift store just to listen to them. The first few tapes were normal. My uncle's voice talking about work, weather, animals he'd seen. His tone was calm, steady, the voice I remembered. But the third tape was different. His voice sounded tired, strained. He was recording from an old logging cabin deep in the Blue Ridge, a place he'd stayed alone for a few weeks one winter. The first night there, he said, he heard soft tapping on the window around 2 in the morning. He thought it was a branch at first. The second night, the tapping came again, longer this time, more rhythmic. By the third night, he was convinced someone was standing outside looking in through the glass. He said he was afraid to look back. The tape ended abruptly with him saying, "If I see it standing there again, I don't know what I'll do." Then just the sound of his breathing, heavy and uneven, before the recording cut out. I sat there in silence for a long time after that tape ended. My uncle had never mentioned this to anyone, at least not that I knew of. Whatever happened in that cabin had shaken him badly enough to record it, but not badly enough to talk about it. I needed to know what he'd experienced. I needed to understand. So I made plans to find that cabin myself. Using the details from the tape, I pinpointed the location. It was remote, accessible only by a rough dirt road and then a long hike through dense forest. I packed supplies for 3 days and 2 nights, loaded up my truck, and headed out on a Friday morning in late April. The drive took almost 4 hours, the last two on a narrow Forest Service road that barely qualified as drivable. Branches scraped against my truck. Rocks clattered under the tires. When I couldn't drive any further, I parked and started hiking. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with years of neglect. I pushed through thick underbrush, climbed over fallen logs, and navigated steep inclines for about an hour and a half. When I finally found the cabin, it was late afternoon. The structure was old but surprisingly intact. The roof sagged a bit in the middle, but the walls were solid. The windows still had glass, though covered in grime. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges but still functioned. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior smelled of damp wood and decay. Dust covered everything. There was a small table near the window, an old iron bed frame with a bare mattress, and a stone fireplace in the corner. I spent the next hour cleaning up a space to sleep, wiping down the table, checking the windows to make sure they all closed properly. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the bed, set up my camp stove on the table, and organized my gear. By the time I finished, the sun was setting. I cooked a simple dinner, heated water for instant coffee, and sat by the window watching the forest darken. There's something about being alone in the woods that feels almost sacred. No traffic, no voices, no artificial light. Just trees and silence and the fading glow of dusk. But as night fell completely, I felt a shift. The peacefulness turned into something else, something heavier. I thought about the tape, about my uncle's voice when he said he was afraid to look. I checked each window again, making sure they were shut tight, then climbed into my sleeping bag. I kept my headlamp within reach and tried to sleep. I didn't sleep well that first night. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside. It was distinct, the snap of a branch breaking underfoot. I lay completely still, listening. The sound came from somewhere near the back of the cabin, then silence. I waited for maybe 20 minutes, straining to hear anything else. Nothing came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. I finally drifted back to sleep around 1:30. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. Everything looked normal, safe. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to explore the area around the cabin. I walked in widening circles, looking for tracks, broken branches, anything that might explain the sound from the night before. I found nothing. No footprints, no fresh disturbances in the undergrowth. Just dry leaves and moss-covered earth. I hiked further out, maybe half a mile, and found a small creek. I refilled my water bottles, sat on a boulder for a while, then headed back as the afternoon light began to fade. I didn't want to be caught far from the cabin after dark. That evening, I cooked dinner early and ate while there was still daylight. After cleaning up, I pulled out the cassette player and listened to my uncle's tape again. His voice sounded even more frightened this time. There was a part I'd missed before where he said, "It doesn't come inside, but it wants me to know it's there." Hearing that made my skin crawl. I turned off the player and sat in the growing darkness. I checked the front door. It didn't have a proper lock, just an old wooden latch. I secured it as best I could. I placed my flashlight and hunting knife right by the door within easy reach. If something happened, I wanted them immediately available. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 9, left a small battery lantern on for dim light, and tried to relax. But my mind kept returning to the tape, to my uncle's fear, to the sound I'd heard the night before. I must have fallen asleep because I woke suddenly in complete darkness. The lantern had died. I reached for my main flashlight by the door, but my hand found empty space. The flashlight wasn't there. My heart began racing. I felt around more frantically. The knife was gone too. Both of them vanished. Panic started rising in my chest. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. Faint moonlight came through the windows, just enough to make out shapes. That's when I noticed the window on the left side, the one facing the deepest part of the forest. It was open, not wide, just a few inches. I knew I'd closed it before going to sleep. I was certain. I stared at that window and my blood turned to ice. There was someone standing outside, a dark silhouette pressed against the glass, tall and motionless. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a person. It stood perfectly still, and though I couldn't see a face, I knew it was looking directly at me. We stayed like that, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes. Time stopped meaning anything. My hand fumbled in my sleeping bag for the backup flashlight I'd packed. My fingers finally closed around it. I clicked it on and aimed the beam at the window. The figure was gone, instantly. No sound of footsteps running away, no rustling of leaves. It simply wasn't there anymore. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, shining the light outside. Nothing. The forest was empty. I checked every other window. They were all closed tight just as I'd left them. Only the left window stood partially open. I searched the entire cabin for my flashlight and knife. They were nowhere. Not under the bed, not behind the table, not in my bag. They'd simply disappeared. I sat back down on the bed, gripping the small backup light, and I didn't move until sunrise. The moment the sky began to lighten, around 5 in the morning, I packed everything. I didn't fold my sleeping bag neatly or organize my gear. I just shoved it all into my backpack. I didn't care about the missing flashlight and knife. I just needed to leave. I opened the cabin door and stepped out without looking back. I walked fast down the trail, not quite running but close to it. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest was unnaturally silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. It took me only 40 minutes to reach my truck when it had taken 90 minutes the day before. My hands shook as I unlocked it. I drove out of there like I was being chased, tires kicking up dirt and stones. I didn't slow down until I hit paved road 2 hours later. I found the first cheap motel in a small town and rented a room. I locked the door, lay on the bed fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep. I just kept seeing that figure standing at the window, motionless, watching. I stayed in that motel for 3 days. I barely left the room except to buy food. I spent hours online searching for any information about the cabin, looking through forums, Reddit threads, local news archives. I searched for anyone who'd reported something similar. I found absolutely nothing. It was as if no one had ever experienced what I had, or if they had, they never spoke about it. When I finally went home, I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my girlfriend, not my friends. My mom asked once if I'd gone through all of my uncle's things yet. I just said yes and changed the subject. I didn't mention the tapes. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. Maybe fear and isolation played tricks on my mind. Maybe the darkness and my uncle's warnings created something that wasn't really there. But the flashlight and knife were real. They were gone. The window was open when I'd closed it. And that figure standing outside, I saw it. I know I did. It's been months now. I still don't have answers, just questions and a deep, lingering fear. The same fear I heard in my uncle's voice on that tape. Now I understand why he never went back. I understand why he never told anyone. Because who would believe it? But it was there. And maybe it still is, waiting in that cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, watching through the windows, waiting for the next person who's foolish enough to stay the night.